Well, Paul Hanley, thank you very much for coming to the Wilmot Institute's booth and participating in this live webcast about the various things that you've been doing for the faith. Of course, you've just published a book on Richard St. Barbe Baker, the Man of the Trees, and he's a fascinating man. Why don't you tell our listeners about Sir Richard St. Barbe Baker?
Well, Richard St. Barbe Baker is probably one of the most interesting characters around. He lived from 1889 to 1892.
1990.
1889 to 1982. There we go. Till he was 92.
God bless him.
And so for about 6 decades, he traveled the world spreading the gospel of trees, planting trees. And his view was that planting more and more and more trees was the solution to all of our environmental problems. And interestingly, if you start looking at work that science is doing on climate change and so on, the idea of increasing our biocapacity by planting trees is becoming more and more prominent all the time. So all these big questions that we're dealing with today, like climate change and biodiversity and rainforest loss, and desert spreading deserts and so on, he was on to by about the 1920s. So a very, very deeply insightful person, almost like kind of like a Old Testament prophet or something warning us. He was prophetic. Yeah.
In fact, he worked with the Maasai quite early, I understand, in Kenya.
Well, the Kikuyus were his main group he worked with. So in 1920, he was appointed Assistant Conservator of Forests in Kenya.
Wow.
So he realized once he got there, his task was really kind of paving the way for deforestation by forestry companies that were coming in there.
Oh, so that was his job, to help them deforest.
His real job, although he was called Conservator of Forests. So the combination of this industrial forestry by colonial companies coming into Africa, and then the slash and burn as the population was increasing, was really starting to destroy the forests. And you were also starting to get the Sahara coming south
Somalia,
into Kenya, northern parts of Kenya, and later in Nigeria where he worked as well. So he realized that people needed to start planting trees. And the Kikuyu said, no, tree planting is God's business. And so he had to convince them that you had to help God. God wants us to help him.
God needs help in various things, after all.
God needs us to help ourselves. So, but what he was really good at, I think, was both listening to nature and listening to people. So he really kind of listened to the Kikuyu. He learned the language, and he learned Swahili anyway, Kiswahili, and then he figured out everything they did was involved dancing. So he started something called the Dance of the Trees, and he got thousands of warriors to come together for this first Dance of the Trees, and promised to plant trees, and he gave them prizes of a fat ox or something, and kind of figured out what worked with them, and it was very effective. And he got these guys to plant trees instead of fighting with each other, and that was the Dance of the Trees. And then that was the start of the Men of the Trees, which is the organization he started, which I'm claiming is the first environmental non-governmental organization working on a global scale. So it started back then. It still exists, although they changed it to a more appropriate name for today, the International Tree Foundation. And also the branches in Australia are now called Trillion Trees, and they have this goal of planting 1 trillion trees. So there's about 3 or 4 trillion trees in the world, so we're talking about planting another 25-30% more trees. So a huge goal, but something that could really address a lot of problems we have in terms of climate change, biodiversity, erosion, and so on.
CO2 also, because they'll pull it out of the atmosphere.
Exactly.
And Shoghi Effendi, the head of the Baha'i faith, was one of the first members of the